Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started this morning, well, afternoon for some of you. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amy Cross. I'm the project coordinator with the National Pesticide Information Center, and I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. So for those of you that have questions during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A chat function. That should be provided for you through the Zoom interface. And then at the end of the presentation, which is actually going to be shorter today, it won't be the full hour. After the presentation, we'll leave time for questions. So feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and then we'll get to those later on. I'm joined here today by a couple of individuals. One is Dr. Fred Berman, DVM. Dr. Berman is the former director of the Toxicology Information Center at the Oregon Institute of Occupational Health Sciences. And Fred works really closely with our case reports here at the National Pesticide Information Center. He helps us review the severity and other cases that come to us both for human and animal incidents. And these incidents are taken by our specialists, and I'll be talking a little bit more about those later. I'm also joined by the veterinary tools developer, Sean Ross. So if any of you have technical questions or suggestions for the tool, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about that after the presentation. So today I'm going to start by introducing the National Pesticide Information Center, because I know that many of you may not be familiar with our services. Very briefly, I'll touch on our role as a risk communication center centered around pesticides, and then we'll go into some definitions. What is considered a pesticide, and why is regulation important surrounding certain pesticides related to veterinary science? Then I'll go into an introduction of the vet portal itself and do a live demonstration on our website. Afterwards, we're going to have plenty of time for questions, so please don't hesitate to type those questions into that Q&A chat box. So who is NPIC? NPIC, or the National Pesticide Information Center, we are formed as a cooperative agreement through Oregon State University and the US EPA. And our purpose is to provide objective, science-based information about pesticides, not only to the general public, but also to professionals. And we do this with the goal of promoting informed decision-making. We really want to make sure that individuals have tools at their disposal in order to make the best decisions for them and for their families. And we primarily fulfill this mission by operating a toll-free hotline. The 800 number is listed there. And our hours are slightly shortened. If you're already familiar with our center, in the past we did have longer hours, but now we're open from 8 to noon, Monday through Friday, and that's Pacific time, so 8 to noon Pacific time or 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern time. Now, we recognize that those hours may not be convenient for everyone. We do also take email inquiries, we answer voicemails, and then we have a very extensive website. And our website has over 800 pages of pesticide content. The idea being that, you know, if you have some question you need answered at any time, you may be able to find it on the website. And that is where this vet portal is hosted, which means that anytime, night or day, you're going to be able to enter data into this reporting portal. So NPIC receives about 10,000 questions per year, and 85 to 90% of those questions are from the general public, which means most of the questions we answer are about pesticide use inside of and outside of the home. When we talk to an individual of any kind, we're collecting anonymous information about the call. We're summarizing the call and figuring out what types of questions are they asking, what types of resources are we providing, what was the call like. About 15% of the time, we find that there is some type of pesticide incident involved in that call. And we have a very specific definition of a pesticide incident. We count anything that is a spill, a misapplication, or an exposure with or without symptoms for humans and for any animals. We count all of those as pesticide incidents. And then what we do is we keep our information in an internal database that is used by EPA, state agencies, sometimes the CDC requests information, federal, state, tribal. All of those agencies are able to request that data from us, and it's all anonymous data. So this is what our website looks like. If you go to the home page, the front picture is always changing depending on what the topic is. But the idea is that we want to keep new topics always moving. And there's a lot of different places you can go from here. From here, you can search via the chat box. You can look for emergency information if that's what you're there for, or in the lower right-hand corner, if you see that map of the United States. No matter where you are across the United States, we keep a very comprehensive list of state-specific contacts, from the health department to household and hazardous waste to state pesticide regulatory agencies. And there's a whole host of contacts there for your state if you're interested. When we create educational materials to put online, we're creating them based on the information we hear from our callers and emailers. So if there is a trend in questions, we'll leverage that information and turn it into a new fact sheet or a new infographic, or we'll make a special post about it on social media. And the idea with all of our publications is that we want to vary them so that we have diversity of message delivery. We want to make sure that individuals maybe that have a barrier to reading can see more visual items, or if someone has a barrier to seeing items, then there are some audio items as well. And we're going to constantly be upgrading and updating information depending on what's hot topics in the news and with our callers. Okay, so initially I advertised that I was going to do a brief introduction to risk communication. And really, to do it well, a good training in risk communication can take 4 to 5 weeks. That's what our training program looks like for our pesticide specialists before they're even able to talk to anyone over the phone. Obviously, we don't have that time today, and even still, I'd love to talk to you about risk communication for about an hour or so, but we don't have that time. So instead, I'm going to give you a very brief rundown, an introduction. Why do we talk about risk instead of using the word safe or safety? So let's say, for an example, an individual were to ask me, is an application safe? And maybe in this instance, they're talking about a lawn application and they have dogs and they're concerned about their dogs going out onto the lawn. Is it safe for my dogs? So in one instance, I may know that the toxicity of the product is very low, and I may have an idea that the homeowners won't be there, their dogs will be inside, and I have this kind of assessment, and maybe I decide to answer, oh yeah, sure, it'll be safe. Unfortunately, the word safe means different things to different people. It could mean that it's so safe you could eat it to some individuals. And that's really not what I mean. What I mean is that it may be a low risk situation. Okay, but maybe I don't want to use the word risk because I think an individual isn't comfortable with it. So maybe I'm going to try to stick with this safe situation, and I'm going to say, let's take a more precautionary approach. Let's say that, no, this application is not safe. Well, that can give some individuals the idea that this is actually a highly toxic, very dangerous application, and that may simply not be true. In some instances, a pesticide application, if it's low in toxicity and there's little risk of exposure, it can actually be a lower risk option than some manual, like if you're doing weed removal with sharp tools or heavy machinery or equipment. It just depends on the situation. And so I'm not going to use either the words safe or not safe or unsafe. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to reframe their question, and I will physically say to the individual, I'm going to talk to you about what the risks may be, because risk involves 2 items. It involves both the toxicity of the product in the container and also the potential for exposure. That could involve how someone is exposed or how long they're exposed for. So this risk equation, it looks really tidy because it just has those 2 items in it, but it actually can be very powerful because that exposure side of things can help an individual feel empowered to take action to prevent exposure. Whereas the toxicity of the product, once they've chosen which product they're going to use, that toxicity really isn't going to change after dilution, but the exposure scenarios do change and can change. So moving on with risk versus safety. I know that safety is a really easy to explain scenario. Everyone wants to think of the things they do in their life as safe, and it's a yes or no answer. Unfortunately, it may mean that no precautions are necessary to someone, and it may mean that it's the same level of safety for everybody involved. Risk is a more accurate depiction of this because it's more of a sliding scale. It depends on a lot of different factors. It's not just a yes or no. Although it is unfortunately a little bit harder to explain, it incorporates these ideas that if you take precautions, you can reduce risk, and that for certain people, risk is higher. That can depend on their behaviors. Children being on the ground or pets being on the ground, their behavior is a lot different than an adult human. And so their exposure scenario is different and their risk is different. So I'm going to put up a very simple series of ideas here. If someone were to give the impression of safety, it can then lead to careless behaviors and a lack of vigilance, which can then actually lead to riskier behavior and increased risk. So this is a very powerful idea. The idea that even in a situation where I may know that the exposure scenario is low, and I know that the toxicity of the product is low, I'm still always going to provide those measures that someone can take, those things someone can do within their power to reduce exposure to a pesticide, and any agent for that matter. So this checklist, quote unquote, is a boiled down version of all of those items that we try to hit whenever we're talking about pesticides and risk with a caller. First step in communication is not answering, it's listening in order to ask questions and re-paraphrase their concerns. The idea here is that you cannot provide a thorough enough answer without understanding the brunt of their questions. So you're always going to repeat back to them their concerns. Reframing your response in terms of risk rather than safety, and we just discussed why that was so important. Whenever we're discussing the scenario, we will talk about whatever toxicity information we have. If we have a signal word on a product, maybe we know more about it, we'll talk about that. A signal word, for those of you who don't know, is provided on all pesticide packaging. And there's only 3 possible signal words. There's caution, which is low toxicity, warning, which is moderate toxicity, and danger, which is high toxicity. And when you see that printed on a pesticide product, what it means is that they've taken into account all of the most sensitive routes of exposure. So if you get it on your skin and it's low toxicity, but you get it in your eyes and it's permanent damage, then it's going to get a danger label on it. It's going to be considered high toxicity. So if you know what to look for on a pesticide label, that can be part of your conversation in talking about risk. Of course, exposure information is going to be important, and you can think about ways and brainstorm ways to reduce exposure. Now, for outdoor pesticide products or products you may use in the home, this may seem a little simpler. For pesticide products that are directly applied to human skin or to animals, like insect repellents or flea and tick spot-on products, this can be a little bit trickier, but essentially we're thinking of ways to keep the product where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be, for as long as it's supposed to be. And anything outside of that that you can give advice for, that you can give recommendations for to reduce exposure, that's going to reduce risk. Now, if there is a benefit to using the product, it's handy to talk about that benefit. In the absence of benefit, risk really isn't acceptable. Because then why are you submitting yourself to that potential exposure and that potential risk if you don't have a useful or beneficial outcome? So sometimes it can help to actually discuss what those benefits are explicitly. If there are action items within their control, always talk about what they are. Control is important for an individual to feel like they understand the situation a lot better and they have somewhere to go when they can't be in contact with you directly. And then it's also very helpful to have more information about what additional resources are out there. Is there another contact that they can speak with? So I'll use the example here of maybe a family member comes into the veterinary office and asks for precautionary information. They're thinking of having their lawn sprayed, and they're just not sure if they should do it. They're not sure what the risks are. And you as a veterinarian, you may be thinking of their dog and trying to prevent their dog's exposure, but you may not know a whole lot about the pesticide side of things. So if you knew about the National Pesticide Information Center, you would be welcome to provide our phone number, our contact, so that they could fill in the gaps. And I think this also does a lot to building trust, having an objective third-party resource, whatever it may be, to refer that individual to. This is part of our risk communication. So here at NPIC, we always have something in our back pocket. We're always thinking about, is there someone else who can answer the rest of their question better than we can? Okay, so I've kind of used this as an example a couple times now, but just to give you an idea of why someone may contact NPIC, is pets and yard spraying. That we get this question a lot, especially during the summertime. If they have a treatment done to the lawn, maybe they're treating for weeds or insects or various other things, and they have either cats outside or dogs outside or other pets, they may want to contact us to ask about ways that they can prevent their pet's exposure, and we can brainstorm those ideas with them. Or maybe they're considering 2 products and they want to know different information about each of them. We can pull up, if it's chemical information, they want to know whether or not it has the potential to contaminate their well water, or if it has the potential to create fumes outside. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down both those products with the individual and then help them make that choice for themselves. Again, our goal is to promote informed decision making. Okay, so now let's move on to the next part of the webinar. What is a pesticide? The definition via EPA is any substance that's intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest. And there are a couple of additional points to this definition, but we'll stick with this main part. And EPA is the regulating body for pesticides. So this includes flea spot-on products for pets. And I'm going to put a little asterisk on that one and come back to it because it doesn't include all of them, but it does include many of them. Also, it can include weed killers, anything that you might use outside on the lawn to get rid of weeds. Rodenticides are an example, as well as fungicides. And this is an interesting one, cleaning agents that are basically destroying or getting rid of bacteria, viruses, germs. So anything that's meant to sanitize, disinfect, not just a cleaning agent, but an actual disinfecting agent. Those are also regulated as pesticides by the US EPA. And then this is an odd one, but insect repellents meant to repel mosquitoes and ticks off of human skin. Those are directly applied to human skin, but they're not regulated by the FDA. They're regulated by the EPA instead. And so what do all these have in common? They're all EPA regulated pesticide types. Let's talk about a little bit of a special case, and that's regulations surrounding flea and tick products. I've got a couple of different products up here right now. One of them is a flea collar, one's a flea shampoo, the other one might be a space and bedding spray. But then what about those silly spot-ons? There's a whole bunch of different ones there too. So if it's an EPA regulated product that is not intended to be distributed throughout the bloodstream of the animal or the person, then it is considered a non-systemic product. So this list includes all of those products that are FDA regulated as pesticides. At the very bottom, you'll see non-systemic spot-ons. Now for the FDA side of things, any oral flea and tick pills or chews, any spot-on products that go on the skin but are designed to be absorbed into the bloodstream and then distributed throughout the body, all of those systemic products, those are regulated as drugs by the FDA. And that can be important because the labels are going to look slightly different, and the information where you go to find more information is going to be slightly different. For example, here at NPIC, because we don't know a lot of those same ingredients that FDA will approve in those drug products, we may not have toxicity information for those active ingredients for what's in those systemic spot-ons. And the FDA has another hotline, and we actually have a phone number for that on our desk because we know we get this question a lot, so we can refer individuals to the correct place. But it's important to know that the difference between the FDA and the EPA regulated products, they center around whether or not they're systemic and going into the bloodstream. Okay, so very briefly, I'd like to talk about some, I don't want to call them bad players. It's just that we hear about these active ingredients and these products a lot when we hear about pet poisonings. And I think it's just that because we hear them so common, we think of these incidents as happening a lot, but it may just be that they're reaching us more often than not. So I'll go briefly into some slug and snail baits. I'll talk about metaldehyde and iron phosphate. I'll talk briefly about some rodenticide types. And then I'll look at some flea products and some of those active ingredients as well. So slug and snail products. It used to be, prior to 2006, that metaldehyde was the major active ingredient that was used in slug and snail baits. Now, I live in the Pacific Northwest where we have a lot of slugs and snails. So this actually is a bigger problem depending on what your weather and what your animal diversity is like. Metaldehyde is incredibly toxic to mammals. And although there were sprays and liquids, pellets were most often used. And the pellets themselves are mixed with attractants, tasty things that get slugs and snails to eat them. Now, if a mammal were to eat these pellets, either within minutes or sometimes hours later, they can experience what we would call a shake and bake syndrome. And it's called shake and bake because they're getting tremors, they're having central nervous system effects, and it's characteristic that there's going to be a very high temperature, sometimes of 107 degrees plus. And of course, then that can result in tissue failure and organ failure. So like I said, at 2006, EPA actually put new labeling requirements onto these metaldehyde products to try to prevent poisonings to some pets. And a new player came onto the market, or a more popular player came onto the market, and that was iron phosphate. Now, iron phosphate is low in toxicity. It does, however, also have pelleted form and uses those same kinds of attractants, things that slugs and snails might find tasty, dogs also find tasty. It also created new pet-friendly messaging on a lot of the products. And that pet-friendly messaging, you can see that screenshot there before, or down at the bottom there, it says can be used around pets and wildlife. That is kind of the characteristic case I talked about before with risk messaging. In some instances, because an individual saw the pet-friendly messaging and then they saw their pet eating the pellets, they thought to themselves, I don't have to worry about it because it's fine for my pet. And then the dog or the animal ends up eating a huge amount of those pellets. I've taken a call personally where an individual had a bag, several pounds of this sitting in their garage, and they allowed the dog to eat from the bag without stopping them. Now, several cups of this is, it's all about the dose, right? So it may be a low toxicity product, but because that exposure was really, really high, then we have a higher risk situation. Now, with lower exposures, gastrointestinal upset or symptoms is characteristic, but when you have a really high exposure, those gastrointestinal symptoms may subside, and then there's a latency period of 12 to 96 hours, after which the animal begins to experience new symptoms such as blood pressure changes, heart rate effects, and then that can possibly lead to shock or death in the animal. And that's because of the iron poisoning. Okay, so switching gears to rodenticides, I won't be able to cover all classes of rodenticides, but I chose the top 3 that I thought I've seen most often when an individual reports an accidental exposure to NPIC. Bromethalin is one type of active ingredient. This is not an anticoagulant, so this is not going to have anything to do with bruising or bleeding. It has a high toxicity and it targets the central nervous system. It actually shuts down cell energy, which can cause swelling, and that swelling in the brain can cause paralysis and death. The onset can vary from a few hours to a few days. So this is an active ingredient that individuals don't necessarily know that there are rodenticides that aren't anticoagulants, and this is just an example of one of those. Okay, so now for the anticoagulants, there are a couple different types. They can be considered multi-dose or single dose, and the difference between multi-dose and single dose is that although the time frame to death is still about 5 to 7 days after ingestion, if, let's say, a rodent only has a single dose and doesn't have, if it's eating a single dose and doesn't have any more in 5 to 7 days, it'll pass away. But for multiple dose, it needs to go back several times. Now, what makes single dose very dangerous for pets is that if a rodent goes back night after night and continues to eat the highly toxic single dose anticoagulants, over the course of 5 to 7 days before their vitamin K runs out, they have a store of vitamin K in their system that's going to help them with blood clotting. Before that runs out, what they've done is they've accumulated 5 to 7 deadly doses over that time period before they've passed away. So if a dog were to find a rodent that had that much of the single dose product in its system, then it's going to be very toxic for that dog or cat or whatever animal is eating the poisoned rodent. So it is a high secondary poisoning risk. Another rodenticide that we hear a lot about is zinc phosphide. So zinc phosphide is often pelleted and it's used for burrowing rodents. The idea is that once it mixes with stomach acid, that stomach acid causes it to produce a gas, and the phosphine gas is highly toxic. With rodents, they don't have a vomit reflex, so then they're going to keep that in their system until death. But with dogs or other animals that might find the pellets and eat them, they will vomit from that gas production. And if they vomit in the home or around people, that gas that's coming up off of the stomach contents can actually still be toxic to anybody in the area. So with symptoms, there can be a quick onset if the animal doesn't have any food in its stomach, 1 to 4 hours, and it can be delayed if the animal has recently fed. Symptoms include things like vomiting, not being able to walk, stumbling, coordination, tremors, convulsions, and then in some cases death. And this is going to be dose dependent. Okay, so moving on to flea products, I'm going to speed through this a little bit more quickly because a lot of this information is kind of technical and it is available in a lot of different texts. So for flea products, you may see insect growth regulators listed on the label like pyriproxyfen and methoprene, and they're pretty low in toxicity. You may see synergists listed on the label like piperonyl butoxide and MGK 264. They're also pretty low in toxicity. The difference between these two is that insect growth regulators are hormones that are targeting the insect hormone. They're hormone mimics. And synergists are essentially keeping the insect's enzyme activity low so that they can't break down a pesticide. So these are two ingredients that are often added to flea and tick products, whether they be spot-ons or space sprays. Now, pyrethrins and pyrethroids, these are common active ingredients in flea products. It's important to note that permethrin cats are highly sensitive. Others that you might see on labels, either for space sprays or spot-ons, include bifenthrin, alethrin, deltamethrin, and resmethrin, and more. These usually have low dermal toxicity, but they do have characteristic irritation to the skin. They can range in oral toxicity from very low to high, so it just depends on the product and it depends on the active ingredient. Another common ingredient in flea products are neonicotinoids. This can include things like imidacloprid, dinotefuran, acetamiprid, and others. They generally have low to moderate oral toxicity, and the effects are similar to nicotine poisoning. So you may see things like respiratory or gastrointestinal upset, all the way to tremors and nerve effects. Okay, so this is an example of a label. It's obviously a made-up label, but I wanted to show you that if, let's say a patient comes in and their owner has the product that they think the animal ingested. There are a couple key facts on this label. They're going to help you identify what's in the product and where to find more information. So the EPA registration number is not always going to be located in the same place on the label, unfortunately, but this is the only sure way to identify a product. From state to state, the names can change, but that EPA registration number always stays the same. The product name at the top is going to be important if you're looking in a state, if we're looking in a state database for information, or if we're going to contact the manufacturer. The active ingredients and their percentages are always listed, and that can help if you have, let's say you have a text that's going to give you treatment information, you're going to look for those active ingredients. and like I said, the concentration as well. So if you were to call NPIC for information about an active ingredient or about a product, if you had that EPA registration number, we are essentially able to look up all of the label information at once. So that EPA registration number is very powerful, and it helps you identify the product. You'll notice at the bottom left of this label, there is a signal word of warning. It just says it in bold letters. So that means that this product has moderate toxicity by some route of exposure. Okay, so what is the veterinary portal? I'll refer to it as the VIRP, sometimes the VIRP. The Veterinary Pesticide Incident Reporting Portal is specifically designed for veterinarians and their staff to document adverse animal effects. This data may be sent in its entirety to EPA. Occasionally they will request those reports, but we are not vetting any of the information on there. It is as you enter it. Also, it's not designed for any targeted enforcement. It's designed for informational purposes only. So why might you want to submit a case to this vet portal? The EPA will reevaluate active ingredients usually on a 15-year basis, and whenever they do that, they're looking for any information they have about adverse effects. Now, they will have studies where there are animal testing, either on rodents or other animals, so that they can see what the effects may be, but if you have real-world experience with a product and they have more data, then it can be more informative for that regulatory reason, especially for newer products, because newer products may not have as much of that real-world data. So these reports can be very handy for, otherwise there's just a dearth of information. There's not much. I'd like to give an example here, and that's a series of permethrin flea products that were designed for cats. In 2002, NPIC, we received over 300 questions about flea products containing permethrin for cats, and a lot of these contained reports of adverse reactions for those poor cats. And so because we had this flood of information, we were able to send our data to EPA to show them that. At the time, the vet portal wasn't in existence. It couldn't be used. But what's nice about having it online now is that if a vet is seeing repeat of symptoms or problems, depending on whatever the product is, you're able to submit that report anytime, night or day. And those reports can go to EPA directly as they are sent. So who should use the portal? Either public or private veterinary professionals, their techs, or anyone within their vet office that has the details of the incident. So I've heard of situations where a veterinarian will provide an assistant with the file for a patient, and if the file contains all of the information that the assistant needs to fill out the portal, then that for their office worked well. Other instances, the veterinarian themselves wants to enter the information. It doesn't matter to us as long as it's someone within a professional's office that is doing that data entry. So anytime there is either illness or death of any animal that you actually physically saw and was a patient, no matter how they were exposed, we want that data to be submitted. And it doesn't matter if you know what the pesticide was. If you suspect that it was a pesticide, for example, if they tell you that it was a rodenticide, it was to kill rats or something to that effect, then in our database, it's still going to be helpful to know what kinds of symptoms and what the outcome was. So there are some pieces of data that are required in order to submit the report. We do ask for your clinic and company information to verify that it is a professional submitting the report. Even if you don't know product information, you can still enter quote unquote unknown, but you'll have to enter something into the product field. You'll have to know how the animal was exposed and what kinds of symptoms they had, and then whatever the outcome was. Maybe you're still treating them, it's ongoing, or maybe they've recovered and they have some leftover effects. Whatever it is, we need to know what the outcome was. There's also more rich optional data that you can add as well. Things like specific product information, what kind of pesticide it was and its formulation. We'd love to know information about the animals, their breed, their weight, their age, all of those items, and any additional details that you can provide. You get to type in about the exposure, the toxicity, or the outcome. So now what I'd like to do is switch gears and go to the portal itself. And because the portal was designed to be actually have the information entered pretty quickly, this step of it won't actually take very long. So I'm actually now on the NPIC website, and this is the first page that you'll see with the portal, and it asks you to verify that yes, you are a veterinarian before entering the portal. So I'm going to go ahead and click yes, I'm a veterinarian. And so the first thing I'm going to do is start typing in my clinic information. And what you'll see is as I enter information, required fields will turn green when I've completed them. Bear with me. Okay, and also a phone number. I'm just going to put in any old number for the purpose of the demonstration, and an email address. Okay, so now we can see that all of the fields that were required have turned green, and we're ready to go on to the next step. So this step is asking about product information, and I'm just putting in, this is a dummy product, it doesn't actually exist, but did you see that pop up there? It told me more information about the EPA registration number, and several of these fields have that feature so that as I go through the portal, if I'm not sure exactly what it's asking for, there's a pop-up telling me more information about what I'm trying to enter. So for this instance, I'm going to say that it was an insecticide, and the formulation was a spot on. So this was a between the shoulder blades application of a flea and tick product. And moving on to the next field, we'll say that this was a dog, and I can put in mixed breed for an optional field. I say it was today, and I examined him today as well. So you do have to put in here what state the exposure occurred in. Now notice as I'm entering the information, new fields are popping up as I go. So it lets you know when you can't move on because you don't have the information. So for this instance, I'm going to say that there was dermal exposure, and I want to provide a few additional details. Maybe I'm going to say the product was applied according to the label. I'm going to give details how it was applied in a thin strip between the shoulder blades. Now for signs of toxicity, I'm going to say that the animal has been experiencing skin irritation. I can scroll through here and see all of these different signs. So if the animal doesn't have any signs of toxicity, you can put that as well. But I'm guessing you're going to use the portal most often when an animal has symptoms and is brought into your office. Now, additional details of the toxicity, I'm going to be a little bit more specific than just skin irritant. So I'm going to say animal began biting and chewing at application site within 15 minutes and had inflamed red skin within 1 hour. So then this tells me the onset of symptoms happened 15 minutes after the exposure. And then we're already to the part about the outcome. I mean, this is most of the portal we've already completed. So for outcome, we're going to say that the case is currently ongoing. And as far as additional details here, as the veterinarian in this scenario, I'm going to say the dog was brought to the clinic within 1 hour of the application and is currently being bathed by the veterinary staff. Okay, so additional fields have stopped popping up, which means I've filled out everything on this page that I need to include about the situation. So here I could go back, or I could go ahead and submit the report now, but let's say maybe I want to add additional notes. Maybe there's something that these fields don't quite capture. I could add additional notes, and that's what this field looks like. Sometimes when a veterinarian calls us, we'll tell them about the portal, but we will offer the first time around to enter the data on their behalf. And if they agree, then we make sure to make a note so that it's understood this data comes from the veterinarian but was entered by us here at NPIC. So now I'm ready to view the final report. And I have a summary of all of the fields here. When I'm all done, I will click Submit Report Now. In this instance, I'm not going to submit it because up to this point, nothing has been saved in the database. And this is just a dummy report, and I am live on our website. But it's a fairly straightforward process. And after you've entered data once, you can do it in as little as 5 to 7 minutes. So I feel like this is a really useful tool for veterinarians and their staff to help inform regulators and decision makers about adverse reactions to pesticides. So now what we're going to do is we have time for questions. And I'll go back to the last slide. I actually created slides in case we needed them, but it turns out we didn't. So at this point, I'm going to use the Q&A that I see at the top here. And there aren't any questions yet. I don't see that anybody's answered or asked any questions, but please feel free to type something into the Q&A. We have plenty of time for that. And I'd love to know how we can help you more. Maybe you have questions about NPIC. Will copies of this PowerPoint be provided? Great question. Actually, we're recording the webinar today, and so I'll be posting that live recording. If you would like to email me directly, my email is in all of the reminder email that I've sent out before. I can send you a version that you could use if you wanted to share that with your staff or similar groups. Okay, I see here on the chat, you guys can use the chat function as well as the Q&A. I don't see any other questions, but we're going to hang out here for just a couple more minutes to make sure we get everybody a chance. But at this point, it is the end of the presentation. I want to thank everybody for spending their time with me today. I have Dr. Berman here if you have any questions for a veterinarian. I also have the tools developer on hand if you have any technical questions. So I'm going to give everybody another minute or so to ask anything. Okay, it seems like you all have been very good listeners and didn't have a whole lot of questions. Feel free to use the hotline if you have questions or contact me directly. My name is Amy Cross. That's amy.cross@oregonstate.edu. And thank you all for listening today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.